Folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'm going to do one of my sort of military historical review essays. I like doing these because when one looks at the history, or whether it's a battle or military adventures of going over maybe many years, sometimes it just doesn't add up. It just you just can't make sense of the history that's been described. So clearly either something's missing, or that's been misunderstood, or information that's key has been lost over the time, or something else is it. So we need to, I think, go back and just review the events that occurred, and then put the prism of reality, if you like, to these events and see just how it stacks up. And so, well, is the explanation we've been given in historical accounts, is it good enough? Now, I would argue with Genghis Khan, it's not. So let's just set the scene. So we're talking 1200 AD, so, getting on for 1,000 years ago now. But, and Genghis Khan comes from Mongolia. So that's sort of south of Siberia, north of China. It's about 8,000, give or take 8,000 kilometers, 5,000+ miles away from Europe. It's a long journey across, terrain that's quite unforgiving. So not easy to move an army over that distance, whether it's Genghis Khan or Napoleon Bonaparte or it's a tough gig to move an army over that distance. Now, Mongolia at the time had a population of, give or take, 600,000 to 800,000, depending on whose numbers you look at. If you take all the sort of wider tribes and in the far-flung areas of what today would be part of China or Siberia, you can probably get a population of about 1.8 million, some even as high as 2 million in total. And it's quite a young population overall. People are dying pretty young. It's not technologically advanced. Technologically, it's well behind Europe in terms of metal smelting and iron ore handling and all this sort of stuff. Roads, and so it's where big stone buildings, that sort of thing. So it's well behind technologically and organizationally, in terms of technologies, is well behind where Europe is and many other parts of the world. So we're not talking about a technologically advanced society, and we're talking about a very dispersed, small population over a wide area. Now, there are places in Europe that had only a population of a couple of million, but they were in an area that would be a tenth of the size of Mongolia. So it just wasn't widely dispersed. A lot of the land around Mongolia isn't really much good for farming, so a lot of the people are running things like sheep and goats and that sort of stuff. So you'd say in some cases they're closer to the hunter-gatherer really than they are to the sort of farming communities that exist in Europe at the time. So now this is very implausible to say a society like this, technologically backward, and again, no sort of history of large armies or commanding large armies or anything like that. Typically the armies that raided each other, because Mongolian tribes were constantly warring against each other, their armies were 2,000-3,000. So now suddenly we're supposed to believe that Genghis Khan comes along and he unites all the tribes. He pacifies them or somehow gets them to agree and say, well, look, why don't we all sort of get together and go and invade all these other places, like China or Europe or the Islamic kingdoms in the Middle East or wherever, Persia and so on. So why don't we do that? And they go, oh, yeah, hey, yeah. And they suddenly all become allied and they all agree to accept Genghis Khan's leadership. Now, maybe maybe the guy is like super charismatic and all that sort of stuff. So let's assume that's even possible. So an area of the world that's done nothing but petty tribal bickering and warfare since forever suddenly unites within a few years under Genghis Khan's leadership. Let's suppose that actually happened. I mean, clearly the Genghis Khan's army swept around the place, so that we know as fact. How did it happen, though, given it's such an unlikely sort of thing? Now, Genghis Khan was mobilizing more than 10% of the entire population were being mobilized as a traveling army. This is not an army of defense defending their villages. This is a traveling army, 10% of the population. I mean, this is staggering in anyone's language. I mean, this sort of thing, it's ahistorical in the extreme. So that just seems strange. Now, so we're talking about an army of 150 to 200,000 men in the case of traveling to Europe, that's traveling over 5,000 miles, given the route that they took. I mean, there's 7,000 miles plus would be more accurate. And we're talking 150 to 200,000 men and 400,000 plus horses. This is a monumental, nothing like that's been seen since the days of the Persian Empire, when they were only moving a few hundred kilometers. So here's the army, a massive army by the standards of the day, huge, from a low population, widely dispersed, low technology peasant society. I mean, can you believe that? Just the amount of swords they have to produce. They couldn't even produce that. And the quality of the ironwork in Mongolia at the time was very low. I mean, these swords would have broken on impact. Now you've got a few blacksmith type folks around the place, iron foundries, call them what you like, that do produce higher quality swords, but they're for the elite only. And Genghis Khan is, if you like, sort of mid-ranking nobility in Mongolia. So these people have no experience at handling large armies or the logistical machine required to transport an army that huge with that many horses. I mean, imagine the grazing. You couldn't carry enough fodder to feed the horses, particularly how hard the Mongols worked them. You couldn't carry enough fodder, enough water, and so on. Yet they were able to, we're supposed to believe, traverse vast areas where there was no grazing land, where they could not possibly have brought the fodder along, and where there's little or no water, but somehow they managed to. And maybe they did, but it just seems very unlikely. An army of that size, traveling like that, just the issues with hygiene and health would have been huge. So let's suppose all that's true. Again, we know for a fact Genghis Khan existed, and that his armies rampaged the length and breadth of not only what was the Islamic kingdoms and principalities of the day, but also fighting battles in Poland and Hungary and around what today is Russia and Ukraine. Kiev was put to the torch, for example. So, and then going as far as almost penetrating the borders of what today is modern day Egypt, for goodness sakes. So they got around. How did they do it exactly? This isn't adequately explained. It's pointed out that given the amount of horses, and firstly, they've got a very large cavalry contingent, and there are claims that each person had between 4 and 7 horses, and that's how, each cavalry operative. So that's how they were able to cover vast distance. So what they would do, so we're told, is that they would ride their horses hard, but a horse that's moving at a fair clip can only handle maybe 20 kilometers before it starts to tire. So the claim is that they had all these other horses strung in behind, and they just simply jump onto the next horse until that got tired, then the next horse, and so on. So by using this method, so it's claimed, they were able to cover 50, 60, 70 kilometers in a day, more in some cases. So in summer, where the days are longer, it was claimed they could cover 100 kilometers in a day. So they could overtake the messengers and dispatch riders that were running to the nearest city to say, hey, the Mongols are coming. And the Mongols actually arrived before the dispatch riders got there. The dispatch riders, having only one horse, were having to rest and so on. They can only cover 20, 25 kilometers a day. Now, a marching army, best is going to cover half that much if you've got a heavy tail of the baggage train and all that sort of stuff. So we're supposed to believe that the Mongols were able to travel through areas at high speed without the horses needing to drink or eat. No, I just don't accept that. Now, there are claims up, but they were hardy steppe ponies. No, they still got to eat and drink. And the amount of grazing land and fodder you would need for 400,000 horses is extensive. You need vast areas of grazing for that. Tens of thousands of acres of good grazing land. And there's not much of that around. Now, the only way you can travel if you with that many horses is through areas that have that prime grazing. Now, that prime grazing only exists at certain times of the year, yet the Mongols were able to move during winter. They were able to, and again, move vast distances in winter and also in other seasons. They didn't have to wait until spring. Now, if you look, sort of just put in some perspective, when Napoleon Bonaparte's army is traveling through to invade Russia and capture Moscow and all this sort of stuff, and he's got quite a big army. The Grand Army was 500,000 plus. Tens of thousands of horses and bullocks and so on pulling the baggage train, and they had a problem with they couldn't get enough prime grazing or enough useful grazing land for the horses, so they had to carry or grab what fodder they could. Given the fodder was green and not fully cured, the horses were getting sick and dying, and so they lost a lot of horses through that, and they were far more advanced technologically than the Mongols could even dream of. Now, it was pointed out the Mongols had a bow that could be accurate up to 300 meters, whereas the European longbow could only be accurate to sort of 150 meters approx. Then there was the crossbow, which was around at the time, which was lethal, but in a shorter range, more accurate. Bolt could penetrate armor and so on, and that wasn't as widely used as the longbow. So the Mongols, it was claimed, could come into shooting range with their long-range bows and start showering the Europeans and others with arrows, whereas the Europeans couldn't respond because their bows didn't have the distance. It's only when the Mongols began to go into close quarters fighting that the things like the crossbow could come in. And now, also the Mongols supposedly use a quilted silk tunic for their soldiers. Now, the benefit of that is that when an arrow strikes you, it is the silk, if it's thick enough, has a blunting effect, but also the silk wraps around the arrowhead. It doesn't get pierced, so they could effectively pull the arrow out. So the injury would be less. The arrow could be removed without cutting as deep as it otherwise would, and therefore they had a much higher survival rate of their soldiers. And they had, so it was claimed, an effective traveling sort of hospital type. Again, I dispute that, given the amount of people involved. When you've got armies of that size moving over those sort of distances, over those sorts of terrains, I doubt you could have no other place in the world had advanced medicine to cater for those sorts of wide range of eventualities, including, of course, battlefield casualties. Similarly, the quality of the Mongol swords, they couldn't have been much good given their smelting capabilities, unless they were taking swords from others. But so the European quality of ironwork and so on, of curing metals, was far in advance of what the Mongols could do. So I don't buy that. So now, on top of this, we're supposed to believe that Genghis Khan was a military, tactical, strategic genius. So a guy who comes from peasant villages in the middle of fucking nowhere suddenly becomes a great military genius and can command armies of, or him and his goons and so on, could command armies of hundreds of thousands. A cavalry mass of 400,000 horses, could command those with precision, striking power and capability, and defeat all. Now, there's no doubt that Genghis Khan's armies were defeating the others. He was even where the Mongols were outnumbered, we're supposed to believe that Genghis Khan was able to achieve great victories and was able to outclass all the others by far. And some of it's insane. The Mongols were able to successfully send 10,000, 25,000 horses in an encircling motion to come in behind the enemy position, and yet somehow these Europeans and others were just caught completely unaware by this. They just didn't know it was happening. They didn't post any lookouts. They didn't have any scouts out looking for these sorts of things. The people who were opposing Genghis Khan are presented as being, they must have been utter incompetence of the first, incompetence on steroids. You couldn't get people that incompetent. When you look at the description, at least of the battles that occurred, the Mongols were doing pretty basic stuff, try and envelopment or try and send cavalry to come in behind. I mean, this is 101. Even a first year military student would sort of try things like that. Yet time and time again, if not in every instance, the Mongols were able to catch their enemies with their trousers down, completely flat-footed and unable to respond, not knowing what to do. And they were able to, so we're told, inflict defeats with great slaughter on their enemies. Similarly, they also acquired the skills of siege warfare and did this very quickly. And maybe it's possible. Maybe Genghis Khan again was a guy who's very open to new ideas and new practices. He comes from a very unlikely sort of situation to doing that. If it was a European, you'd say, okay, all right, well, that's it. But as the Europeans were bickering amongst themselves, Genghis Khan, with his united and a huge army by the standards of the day, were able to go around and inflict defeats left, right, and centre on all who opposed them. It's difficult to see, just looking at the history, the Mongols didn't suffer a single defeat. It was quite some years after Genghis Khan died, that a relatively small Mongol army of 25 or 30,000 that had broken off from the main body and was heading into Egypt or through what's modern day Israel, and were able to were defeated by a much greater force. But it's difficult to conceive that every single encounter that the Mongols came across, that they were the vastly superior organisationally, better trained, better disciplined, better equipped, better led army. It just seems inconceivable. So there's something missing in the historical account of this. Maybe the Mongols could certainly move very quickly. Their main cavalry force, again, if they were travelling those sort of distances in a short space of time, they could very quickly arrive at the city gates and start harassing and attacking the defenders of the city. Even if it was a walled, fortified city, could start harassing very unexpectedly. They could just appear sort of out of nowhere before anyone could give a warning. I mean, even if you look at a lookout tower, they maybe at best have 20 minutes, half an hour warning that the Mongols were coming. That's not enough time to organise things. So there's other than that, and that would have been a decisive factor, I think. Other than that, it's very difficult to see. Maybe the Mongols were arriving at the city gates so quickly that the armies were simply not able to coordinate and get together. Reinforcements couldn't arrive. The army couldn't assemble in one spot effectively. Maybe the supplies were being cut off by the Mongol cavalry. There would be a much larger cavalry contingent than any of the others, and they were harassing supply of water and supply of food and other things. All the Mongols had to do was wait a few days and harass the supply lines, and that would be enough to wear down the opposing army without really needing to do a whole lot. So that maybe there are factors like that to be considered, but it's inconceivable that every army that the Mongols came across, that they completely outclassed them in everything, generalship to weaponry to everything. That is inconceivable. So there has to be another factor here at play, and I would argue the only factor that I can see that stands out is this mobility. The cavalry having multiple horses and being able to cover 50 kilometers or something in a day, 100 kilometers in summer. That's the only thing I can see. But the claim is that the cavalry were able to cover these distances in the height of winter, when there's no grazing land, there's no fodder, there's nothing. And yet somehow they're able to carry enough fodder with them to feed hundreds of thousands of horses and covering hundreds of kilometers in just a few days. See, I don't buy that. I just don't see that's possible. Maybe it is, but it's not being adequately described in the histories. So I think we need to revisit the whole Genghis Khan thing and really get down to the hard details of the logistics. Just don't match up to the exploits. And because of that, we need to, I think, look deeper into this. Just as an aside, and at the end, Genghis Khan is revered as a great hero. There's fucking statues of him everywhere you look in Mongolia. And they see him as a hero, even though he was as barbaric and murderous as you can possibly imagine. And in terms of death, just putting people to the sword, including children, by the way, including babies. I mean, they grab babies and just throw them into fires and rivers, and so we're hardly talking about a cool dude here, but he's revered in Mongolia as being a great man and a great leader and a great warrior and so on and so forth, and a great historical figure that the Mongolians should be proud of. And well done to them if that's, but notice in the West that there is a vicious and aggressive program to denigrate and humiliate every Western hero, every white Western hero that exists. And look what they're doing in Mongolia, how different it is. You've been a Tassos today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.